Hey everyone, today we're using one of my favorite ingredients. I'm gonna share with you my technique and recipe for roasting these beautiful squash, all in preparation for our upcoming class together. All right, we're talking about here today all different varieties of squashes. Keep in mind here that every pumpkin is a squash, but not every squash is a pumpkin. This technique you can use for any variety of squashes or pumpkins. For my pasta filling, I prefer as many different squashes as I can find. Each one brings a different kind of starchiness, flavor profile, and sweetness to the party that's going to make our filling that much more complex. All right, first things first, let's talk about what we have here, shall we? For today, you've probably seen this one before. This is a butternut squash, available just about year round, the easiest to find. I would use at least this in the recipe as one of your squashes. Then we have these red curry squashes. You could find these, they're red on the outside. They come in all different shapes and sizes, but I love these for their flavor. Super delicious. Down the line, we have these kombucha squashes. Almost sounds like kombucha, but totally different. Sometimes they're red, usually green, again, all different shapes and sizes. Last but not least, we have sugar cube pumpkins. Pumpkins come in all different varieties, of course, perfect for carving, but these even more delicious for roasting. So you can use all of these in your filling, or you can use just one of them. Totally up to you, pick and choose. The adventure is yours. Like I tell you all the time, you're the chef in your own kitchen. So while you can totally use pumpkin puree out of the can as a pasta filling, I definitely do not recommend that. It's not gonna taste nearly as good as roasting your own. Let's get started here. I have some baking trays. I always like to line mine with parchment paper, and then one squash at a time. We'll start with the butternut. Take off the top, take off the bottom, and then take a look at your butternut here. This top part is called the neck. You wanna find and kind of guess where the neck meets the base here, and you're gonna cut it right down in half. All right, I have my squash split in two here. This bottom portion that has all of the seeds, I'm going to open in half. We'll set that aside. I like to scoop all of my seeds at the same time. And the top part, we're just going to open up, set this aside on our baking sheet. Don't have to worry about peeling any of the squashes. We're just gonna scoop out the flesh once it's roasted. Next squash here, same thing. Take off the bottom, take off the top. I like removing the top and bottom. It sometimes gives it something flat and even, so that way it's not rolling around when you're trying to cut it. This we're just gonna split into wedges. Like so. Now we have our red curry. Same thing, we'll go in wedges with this one. Last one here. So now for scooping our seeds, I'm gonna use a bowl. Nice wide spoon works well for this. Fun fact, squashes are actually melons or fruits for that case. Because of all the seeds, they're not vegetables. Now you can go ahead and save all of these seeds, wash them and dry them out and use them as part of our crumble that we're going to make later, or you can just buy some pumpkin seeds already cleaned. Totally up to you. I always like to take out most of that stringy bit that you can from in there, so you have a nice clean interior to your squash. If you're using a variety of different squashes, keep them all together and don't mix and match them. Just in case they cook completely differently in the oven, you can easily pull out and monitor which ones are cooking faster than the others. One thing to be mindful here is you don't want to overcrowd your pan. So use two pans if you need to. Overcrowding the pan will cause the pumpkins to steam and not cook evenly, as the heat won't be able to evenly move around all of the squashes. So all of our seeds here, this makes really nice stock if you want to go that route, or you can continue rinsing this with water, picking out all the seeds, throwing all the innards of the squash to the side, and then these seeds can be dried out and used to make our streusel. If you don't want to go through all of that work like my mom used to make me and my little brothers do during this time of year, then you could buy squash seeds already cleaned and ready to use. So here in this pot, I have some browned butter, super easy to make. Can't really buy this stuff. Just put some regular unsalted butter in a pot, place it over medium-low heat, and just continue to whisk until the butter bubbles. The milk solids will separate. Those will sink to the bottom and start to brown, and before you know it, you'll have brown, toasty butter. So once your butter is brown, we're going to whisk in half of the miso paste, half of our rosemary, and half of our sage. And it's important to do this while the butter is still warm, so it really infuses all of that flavor. All of my squash is laid out here, plenty of even space all the way around. I have my brown butter, set the whisk aside. I like to use a brush for this. You could totally use a spoon and just spoon the butter evenly all over all of the squashes. Be sure to get a nice bit of butter sitting in each of these little squash pockets, and you can go very, very generously with this. I just drape the herbs right over the top. Those will be able to pull off later once these are roasted, and make sure to use every last little bit. Last but not least, we want to get some salt on here. I always like to season from up high. That way the salt falls evenly and disperses over a larger area. It's a really good habit to get into instead of seasoning down here where the salt is landing on a smaller part of the squash or whatever you're putting it on. Seasoning up here allows the salt to fall much more evenly over the entire surface. All right, into the oven. All right, so my squash has been in the oven for almost 2 hours now. Totally, completely tender. I tested that by poking a cake tester into it. You could use a knife. Either way, you want this stuff to be mush. Now I'm going to separate, remove all of these herbs. We don't need them anymore. They've served their purpose. And I'm gonna scoop out all of my squash using a spoon, leaving the skins behind, and putting everything into my food processor. So these are totally delicious. You can eat them just like this and you'll have beautifully roasted squash. So we want to scoop out all of this flesh. This is the part that we're using. This is why I don't bother peeling the squash, because you're able to just really pull all of the flesh right off of the skins once they're completely roasted. And you know, depending on the squash, some of these, the skins are actually edible. The red curry, because it's such a small squash and thin skin, you could eat the skin of this if you were to serve it as a side dish. All right, and then last thing here, just get all of the last of that butter that's on the tray right into your mixer. Squash in the mixer, lid on, and we're just gonna let this rip. All right, I like to let this run for at least a couple of minutes till it gets super smooth and creamy. If you don't have a food processor, you can totally do this by hand with a fork or with a whisk, some sort of masher. It's just gonna take a little longer and your filling may be a little chunkier, but it's still going to be delicious. All right, take a look where we are at now. This has been mixing for a couple of minutes, super smooth all the way around, nice and thick. Sometimes, depending on the varieties of pumpkins that I'm using, there are different water contents, and you'll occasionally have to stick this back into the oven before adding any of your seasonings to it. Draw out a little bit more of that moisture. That'll thicken it up and make it so your pasta filling is not so watery. But if yours looks something very similar to this is exactly where you want to be, and we're ready to season. All right, one thing to note here, before we add any cheeses to our squash filling, we want to make sure the filling is cool to the touch. Whether you use an ice bath to chill this down quickly, or you let it sit in the fridge or at room temperature, you don't want to melt the cheese before it gets added into the pasta filling. You want the cheese to melt when it's inside of the pasta cooking in the water. So I have my ricotta, my Parmesan, breadcrumbs, maple, soy, and miso paste. Keep in mind, all of the amounts for these are on the recipe, and you can put a little more or a little less depending on your own personal tastes, how much pumpkin mix that you're making. Totally up to you, but I promise you're going to love it. Let's get the lid back on one more time. All right, I'll give it a taste. Really good. I'm happy with this. I don't think I need any more salt. I seasoned the pumpkins very well before going into the oven. At this point, we can press it through a sieve or a fine mesh tammy if we want to make this silky smooth. That's what I would do in the restaurant, or if I'm at home cooking for my friends and family, you know what? I might just put this right into piping bags and leave it as is. I'm gonna go ahead and pass my filling here through one of these mesh strainers. That's gonna pull out any chunks or anything that the food processor may have missed and make the filling extra silky smooth. So with my spatula here, I'm scraping the face of the strainer and then using the flat part of the spatula, pressing all of the filling through, helping it along the way. And then the strainer itself is catching any bits of squash skin, little pieces of rosemary that may have gotten in there by accident. Last little bit here. Spatula works really well for this. And then don't forget all of this filling down here at the bottom. This comes off as well. And you can see it did catch a little bit. That would have been totally fine in there. Not a big deal, but I'm a stickler. I like to strain my fillings. All right, last thing here is filling our piping bags. If you don't have a piping bag, you can use a Ziploc bag, pushing everything down to the corner. If you don't have a Ziploc bag, you can totally use 2 spoons and just spoon this onto your ravioli. Not a big deal. Best way to fill these, no matter what kind of pastry piping bag you're using, is to fold the top part down over itself. So that way you're placing the filling as close to the bottom as possible. And then all of the inside of the bag is now the outside, protecting it from getting dirty or messy on the outside. You're able to use your hand to hold the piping bag open, and then with this hand you can just spoon your filling inside. No matter what kind of bag you're using, be sure not to overfill it. If you put too much filling inside your bag, it just becomes really hard to work with. So here I'm just going to twist this off, tie it closed, finish filling my other bag, same thing. So you have a lot of this filling like I do. It works as a really great side dish. You can mix some eggs into it and a little flour and turn it into pancake batter. You can bake it, lay it with some marshmallows on top. It'll be a great holiday side dish. Spread it on crostinis and use it as a little appetizer, maybe some balsamic vinegar drizzled on top. Tons and tons of uses for this extra filling. It also freezes really well, so keep that in mind. Yeah, you know what? You could even probably add a couple of eggs to this and a little extra sugar, bake it in a pie tin, and have yourself some fancy pumpkin pie. All right, that's it. We have our filling set aside, ready to go. I would recommend making the filling and doing this at least a day in advance. You could do it the day of. Just be sure to get this filling chilled. That butter is going to set and it's going to be much easier to pipe into your filled pastas. If you want to do this up to 3 days in advance, that would be great. You could do it a week in advance, but you're probably going to have to freeze this and then defrost it before you want to use it, which isn't a bad thing either. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. Thanks everyone for joining.